We're starting episode 14. There are 2 parts in this episode, but there's a lot to unpack and quite a lot to talk about compared to a lot of other episodes. So let's start. Right off the bat, we are shown the palace in wintertime. And since right now is actually wintertime, more often than not, given the geographic location of China, most regions that used to be a capital city in China would get some amount of snow, and your capitals would have been covered in snow. The Forbidden Palace, which was the capital for Imperial China for the past 7 centuries, it's more often than not covered in snow. This year and last year in particular, there was a big snowstorm, and it was completely covered. A lot of people got out and actually enjoyed the snow scenery because as the Forbidden City has red walls and yellow roofs, that builds a very strong contrast with white snow, so it makes the whole scenery look much better. And you can actually find a lot of these photographs from the Palace Museum website, which is actually formerly known as the Palace Museum website, where professional photographers will take pictures of sceneries in Forbidden Palace every year. And if you look specifically for wintertime pictures, there are a lot of it. And we're shown with a frozen plant over here, which is actually a Virginia. What's interesting about it is this is among a lot of other plants shown in the show, a medicinal plant. Compared to the cordyceps we saw, this is not as rare. It's pretty common. It's not commonly used, but it could be used for cough treatment. And we get to see our new concubine that replaces Ado from a few episodes ago, crossing a screen wall in the shape of a door. This is actually a screen wall meant to be put behind the doorway, essentially giving the room a bit of privacy. Also stops bad energy from flowing in based on Chinese feng shui. There are only 2 door-shaped screen walls in the Forbidden City. I guess they just want to base this on something that's more rare and interesting. Therefore, they basically just use this door design for almost every single palace we've seen. But once again, in reality, there's only 2. And we get to see the new concubine, and her clothing style, as Mao mentioned, seems to be a southern style, even though, at least according to the show, she looked more like a northerner. Of course, with anime drawing style, it's kinda hard to tell where a person's supposed to look like they're from a certain region or not. It typically, unless if you wanna go full-on borderline racist, given the medium of anime, if you want to keep the art style consistent, generally it's more difficult to show people's subtle difference in their facial features. I mean, it is always hard to tell. Some people claim they can tell Chinese and Korean and Japanese apart, but a general rule of thumb is that we can't tell each other apart from time to time. There might be more stereotypical looking Chinese or Korean or Japanese out there that are quote-unquote easier to tell, but more often than not, we couldn't tell each other. Like, I'm a Chinese Canadian. I've seen Korean-speaking ladies ask me for direction in Korean. Like, I couldn't speak Korean. I had to tell them, but they were generally surprised at that not Korean. I've also seen Japanese ask me for direction as well, and it's not like I in particular look very Korean amongst Chinese. I actually don't. If I go to China, nobody mistakes me for a Korean, so it is hard to tell apart from time to time, especially in a medium such as anime. Let's just basically take the word from the show that she looked more like a northerner than a southerner, but she's wearing southern style clothes of the Qiang people in China. What's interesting about the Qiang people is that they live in more or less the actual geographic center of China nowadays. They were considered more like a wastebasket classification for people, as in, if you can't classify them into other ethnicity, you usually throw them into Qiang, which means that their culture diversity would have been very different. Archaeological and anthropological studies have shown that ancestors of both Han Chinese and Tibetans might have been the Proto-Qiang people, which the 2 groups kind of split apart and they were left in the middle. So that kind of also explains the diversity in them. But nonetheless, the specific kind of clothing style does reminisce a lot of Qiang clothes, where if you compare that to traditional Han Chinese clothes, they would have been very different. We have Gyokyo actually inviting Mao into the River Palace again. As we were shown last episode, she started working in the outer court, and because she started working in the outer court, generally speaking, your mobility is very limited. You usually wouldn't be allowed to go to the inner court if you work on the outer court, unless if you were specially requested or called upon, like we're shown in the show. Now, what Mao Mao's role in here is kind of funny. It's essentially a sex ed instructor. One might think that sex ed is more of a modern subject, but back in ancient times in China, usually people were taught about how to essentially reproduce at a certain age. Usually, the traditional marrying age for women in China in antiquity was 15, and for guys it was either 18 or 16, depends on dynasties. If you're a man, you're considered an adult by age 20. Before that, you're still not considered an adult, but you could get married before that. Now, girls typically were considered adults at age 15, at which time they could get married. And usually at that time, if the family's not well off, if the family's poor, generally the mother would just tell the daughter where babies come from. In terms of higher class societies, generally speaking, they would have held something similar to what Mao Mao have over here. You'd have either the mom or nannies actually teach their daughters and show them some what's essentially adult magazine and adult paintings. In particular, those kind of erotic cards, which were usually produced in a book form, would have been a prominent wedding gift amongst the elite and aristocrats. Of course, what Mao Mao's teaching is probably more, let's say, advanced compared to your typical ones. So, if anything, Gokyo and Li Hua would have been exposed to this when they were 15 already. Seeing that by this time in storyline, they're 20 and 24 respectively, and the new concubine, we don't know her age, most likely she would have been exposed to the basics, which just means that Mao Mao's teaching an advanced class. That also explains why Li Shu's not taking this as well, because considering she's only 14 right now, and she was sent to the rear palace at age 9, there's no chance that she actually had even the basics in terms of sex education. So this would have been shocking to her, to say the least. That just adds on top of the fact that you're teaching a 14-year-old about sex education, advanced sex education. The kind of sex education class that would have been given in the rear palace, generally speaking, wouldn't have been done by someone like Mao Mao. They would have found a certain people specifically for that role. I think I've mentioned that a few episodes back as well. They usually would hire a married woman who has had children before to basically go into the rear palace as servants and teach these kind of stuff. Now, we only have surviving photograph of the last dynasty, mainly because photography wasn't invented before that. And we see these kind of older women, generally from a lower class nobleman's family, going into the rear palace, serving essentially as midwives and potentially sex educators for younger concubines, essentially. So that was the kind of role that Mao Mao's filling in. I'm actually surprised they don't have any of that position, but if they do have positions like this and people to fill that position, we don't need Mao Mao, and this kind of interaction, it wouldn't have happened. So for story purpose, you need to exclude these people in order to fit Mao Mao in as a replacement. So essentially, she's replacing the job of old ladies that would otherwise have been the teachers in this kind of sex ed class. Now, for the second half of the episode, we're shown another story. It begins with Junxi doing some essential office work, which actually exceeds his role as a manager of rear palace, because generally managers of rear palace don't really dabble into what's essentially government affairs. Now, given his status, he might be more than that, therefore he might have more responsibility than just to manage the rear palace. That makes sense. However, it just maybe means the title in here is more prominent than what they would have been in history. And Mao Mao was commenting on how it feels wasteful to burn all the papers that Junxi actually wrote on. This was a common practice in Imperial Palace in China, to burn all the unused writing of the emperor or prominent officials, mainly for two reasons. First of all, these papers could have been collected for forgery, and you don't want forgery of people who have so much power, as in a high-ranking government official or just straight up the emperor. And the only way to prevent it is actually to burn the paper so that they couldn't fake the handwriting. Secondly, some people would actually collect this and do certain degree of identity theft, because most people would have never had a chance of meeting either the emperor or a lot of high-ranking officials. Some people will actually just take these, put them on maybe like a fan or something, and just pretend they're someone that they're not. A lot of people would have seen this handwriting rather than meeting the person. They might be able to do that. So for both reasons, for security purposes, these papers would have been burnt. Mao Mao's also doing what her adopted father, as we learned previously, was doing in the Rare Palace when he was a doctor here, which is plant medicinal plants all over. And she essentially just forages around for any kind of plant that could be used as medicinal plant. She did mention two kind of plant in particular, which one would have been very common in everyday life, no matter where you are around the world. And that's dandelion. The other one being moxie, which is quite common in Asia, but maybe not in North America. But moxie also, like dandelion, would have been a very easily grown plant. You plant it somewhere, next year it's gonna cover the entire patch of dirt that you planted in. And moxie is usually used for either extraction of essential oil or used for steam bathing purpose. They are usually burnt for moxibustion treatment. If we remember from episode 4, there was a scene where Mao Mao was steam bathing Li Hua, and if anything, she would have used this on top of just steam. We are shown with Mao Mao foraging was actually red spider lily. They don't have the iconic flowers right now, given that spider lilies generally don't grow their leaves until they had flowers. So usually the flower comes first and then the leaves are grown. And when the leaves wilt away and then flower will go again. You generally don't see flower and leaves on the same plant. Don't trust what Mao Mao says about spider lily. No matter how you prepare it, this is a poisonous plant. Even if it's prepared properly, it's at best medicinal because the kind of effect it has on people is essentially if you prepare it properly, it'll be used as a vomit-inducing agent. In case if you ate something bad and you want to induce vomit to puke everything out. So don't ever try eating this because it's just poisonous. It's not something that you eat ever. Unlike some medicinal plants where it's medicinal and it's also edible. Like the dandelion we mentioned before. Dandelions you can actually boil as a tea and they would have been perfectly fine to drink regularly. They help with cholesterol control if anything. Whereas spider lily, don't ever try it. Now, what's interesting about spider lily is that it's actually viewed differently in Japan compared to in China. The thing about spider lily in Japan is that it's commonly identified as symbolizing afterlife, which gives it one of the names in Japanese, hyanka, which is just afterlife flower. However, the same view wasn't shared by Chinese in antiquity. Now, you've seen a lot of modern Chinese clothing brands actually putting these flowers on clothing inspired by traditional Chinese clothes, which would have been purely inaccurate. You'd have these kind of patterns on kimonos, sure, because Japanese view it more or less as afterlife plants. But you didn't see that in China, mainly because Chinese view the spider lily as a treacherous plant. It symbolized betrayal rather than afterlife, mainly because of two reasons. One reason is that they are poisonous. Second one is because the fact that they flower and then they grow leaves. You're never shown the whole plant. This was seen as an essentially dishonest plant. It never shows its whole plant to you. It never shows its whole body, therefore true intention. So, if anything, nobody would want this to symbolize them. And in antiquity, the more learned and sophisticated people will actually just criticize and nickname someone the spider lily in order to ridicule them because they think that person's dishonest and treacherous. So that's a difference between the views of Chinese and Japanese on the spider lily. However, because of anime and manga and the modern influence of Japanese culture on China, and the fact that the spider lily wasn't really prominent in Chinese symbolism, even though they were first grown in China and then introduced to Japan, younger people in China might actually just know it as an afterlife plant. this person at the end of last episode. We're seeing with him actually investigating what looks like an explosion. And we have his name given, which interestingly enough, although the pronunciation is kind of different, the character they use actually share the same kind of character as Mao Mao's adopted dad. Mao Mao's adopted dad was Luomon, and this guy, although it's pronounced Lakan, they use the same character for last name. And generally, East Asians have their last name first, so something tells me that they might be related just based on the last name, because we're only shown a few people with last names and none of them were the same with one another. Now suddenly we have two people with the same last name. It'll be a surprise if they're not related. And in the case of explosion and fire hazard, traditional Chinese buildings were built with wooden structures. Wood is very easy to burn, so people took fire safety very seriously back then. Even though no matter how serious you are, no matter how diligent you are, things will still happen. We're seeing with this guy named after a famous poet investigating what seems like an explosion at nighttime. The same explosion that the guy in the monocle investigated last night. Given the fact that the Chinese invented gunpowder, explosions would have happened if you didn't handle them very carefully. Although that's not the case in this particular show, there was one very famous, very prominent, and somewhat mysterious explosion which happened in the Ming Dynasty, inside the capital. Well, it didn't happen inside the Forbidden City, it was inside the capital, and the explosion was so strong, it caused about 20,000 deaths. Even the prince of the time, the only prince alive of the emperor during that period, most likely died from shock due to the severity of the explosion. Now, when people mention mysteriousness, there was a very easy explanation. The explosion happened near an area which they'd used to produce gunpowder. So the most logical explanation would have been a gunpowder explosion. But people just didn't believe that black powder could cause such a big explosion, considering the explosion happened in 1626. People's assumption of black powder back then is that it probably wouldn't have caused explosions so big that it could kill 20,000 people at the same time. Although the area was a prominent gunpowder making factory, the kind of explosion supposedly, according to records, generated a mushroom cloud, tore a lot of dead and injured clothes off. Now, before you start questioning historic sources in China, I've seen this attitude in Western academic and general Western knowledge to question Chinese historic records. However, I'd like to add that the Chinese, when it comes to historic records, were actually quite accurate given the kind of understanding at the time. So you'd have mythical elements, but they were only there because people at the time wouldn't have understood this otherwise. The Chinese were pretty accurate. They were recording each time that the Halley Comet actually made it around Earth. Every time you'd calculate that they make a near-Earth appearance, you'd find records in China mentioning giant star tearing through the night. And you'd have records of all the things that happened, good or bad, of certain periods. Emperor assassinating the former emperor to take power. You'd assume that if the record was dishonest and untrustworthy, you'd have these parts taken off. But they weren't, they were kept in it. And you have records of these kind of events. Although it seemed mythical, it should be taken into account and not be dismissed completely as just, weird people writing mysterious stuff. So according to the record, the whole blast basically cleared about a 1.5 kilometer in diameter area of anyone living. It caused every single death amongst the area. Whole bunch of places where people's clothes were torn off. A lot of people were carried around with carriages. They were toppled over. Things were flipped upside down. It seemed to be raining kind of fire from above. So the suspicion was that it might be a gunpowder explosion of a gunpowder factory. However, it might have been triggered by either a meteor or a small-scale earthquake. But since we don't have direct evidence of either, so far, it's only mystery. Now, our explosion is nothing like the one that torn half the city down, but people would have been on watch, and this kind of investigation, that would have been done for a lot of these gunpowder factories and gunpowder storage facilities, mainly for the same reason. If they blew up, it's gonna be very severe. And we have Mao Mao essentially explaining how any kind of powdered ignition could cause an explosion, just your basic science 101 stuff. And she also discovered the smoke pipe from the end of last episode, similar to our guy in the monocle discovering it earlier and didn't take it. Which suggests to me that this story might come back later on, since she took some what's essentially evidence from the scene that this might ultimately tie back to a story later on. So we only have to wait and see for that. Also, in case if you're wondering why the military officer Li Haku didn't know about Mao Mao being dismissed and actually hired back and now working in outer court instead of the rear palace, well, why would he? He's a mid-ranking military officer. Generally, you're not briefed on the affairs of rear palace, given you're just a mid-ranking position. People don't tell you about stuff that goes on in the rear palace. That's not part of your job, and you're not prominent enough for people to have to debrief you on everything. It makes perfect sense that he didn't know anything about her job change right now, and that's the other thing about this show. A small bit of nitpick that I'd assume the author probably didn't think about is that nobody really carries identifications in the palace. If Mao Mao did, as people would have in actual Chinese imperial palaces, then he would have been able to tell that she had a position change, mainly because it'll say so on your identification. It's usually a kind of tablet that also shows which area you are allowed to go in or not, as we mentioned a few episodes back. So if they would have added that would have been a really nice touch on top of everything. The absence of that doesn't hurt the story at all, but if they would have included it, that would have been more complete, if I might put it that way. And we have what's essentially a hook for the next episode of this guy drinking in presumably restaurant. Typically, Chinese restaurant/hotels would have looked like this. Second floor will usually be a few rooms where you'd be lounging, and the first floor usually would have been restaurants. They sell alcohol and some dishes. Some people will just go there and eat and treat it as a restaurant, or others will actually stay. So that's also the thing in China. In modern Mandarin, at least, you have specific terms for hotel and specific terms for restaurant, but sometimes there are terms that are used where you could describe both with that one term, and it's hard to tell which one you're saying. General assumption is that it's a hotel with a pretty nice restaurant. And some of the most famous Chinese restaurants in Beijing actually reside inside hotels. You don't have to actually stay at the hotel to actually go for the food. So if you have an opportunity to go to Beijing, do look them up and don't be surprised if that particular restaurant is inside a hotel. That's just how things were organized and set up in China.